In this series, we're going to be going over all the cards that are currently banned in Modern. We're going over why they're banned and if they could possibly be unbanned. And in this video, we'll start off by going over some of the cards that were banned preemptively when Wizards created the format all the way back in 2011. First off, we have Glimpse of Nature. This is a sorcery that costs 1 green mana and has the effect where, for the rest of the turn, whenever you cast a creature spell, you draw a card. So, why is this card banned? Interestingly enough, Glimpse is currently unbanned in Legacy and Vintage, both of which are more powerful formats than Modern, and it actually sees consistent play in Legacy. This is something that will come up quite a bit in this series, where cards that are banned in Modern have a sort of template in older formats that can show us why they're strong and need to be banned. So in Legacy, Glimpse is the backbone of Legacy Elves. The plan behind Legacy Elves is to cast Glimpse, start casting Elves, and then tap the Elves using Heritage Druid, an elf that lets you tap any of your untapped Elves for mana to generate more mana. The combination of Glimpse and Heritage Druid means that as soon as you keep drawing 1 mana Elves, you can just keep playing more Elves and draw more cards. Heritage Druid is currently completely legal in Modern, so if Glimpse of Nature came off the ban list, Elves deck would basically morph into a worse version of their Legacy counterparts, and would be able to go off and kill their opponent as early as turn 3, if they got lucky and drew their Glimpse and the Heritage Druid. So Glimpse is currently banned to keep those kinds of decks from being able to kill their opponent too early. Could Glimpse be unbanned? Probably not. Elves decks already exist in the format, and unbanning Glimpse would just make them be able to kill your opponent by turn 3. The thing is, there are already other combo decks that can win on turn 3, so Elves wouldn't be pushing the threshold there. However, it may be a lot more consistent than those other turn 3 kills, so that's also a consideration. Still, putting more and more viable turn 3 combos into the format isn't necessarily a good idea, and would probably do a lot more harm than good. So keeping it banned is definitely the safe move. How could Glimpse of Nature be fixed to be unbanned? Funnily enough, there are multiple cards with the same effect as Glimpse that are currently unbanned. Both Rite of Harmony and Beck and Call have essentially identical effects priced at 2 mana as opposed to 1, and they're perfectly fine and don't really see play anywhere, because 2 mana is so much slower than 1 mana is. Though you can fix most cards by just making them cost more mana. Lightning Bolt is a great card, but Open Fire, which does the same thing for more mana, is pretty bad. So for this series, we're going to do something a little bit more interesting and try to change the effects of the card to something else to try to fix it. So something else you could do to fix the card is to make it so you draw the cards at the end of your turn, so you can't use it to extend your plays as much. Though simply making it cost 1 extra mana is definitely the easier fix. Next up, we have the Golgari-Grave Troll. This is a troll skeleton with a mana cost of 4 and 1 green, with the abilities where it enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter for each creature card in your graveyard, and you can pay 1 and remove a +1 counter from it to regenerate the Grave Troll, which means that the next time it would be destroyed this turn, you tap it, remove all damage from it, and remove it from combat. And finally, it has Dredge 6, which means if you would draw a card while it's in your graveyard, you can instead mill 6 and return from your graveyard to your hand. So, why is Golgari-Grave Troll banned? Funnily enough, despite being a pretty good finisher for a graveyard-focused deck, the only line of text that got this card banned was Dredge 6. You see, Dredge is already a deck in Modern, and uses a bunch of cards that also have Dredge to mill a whole bunch of cards with things like Cathartic Reunion. Then they use cards like Necromoeba, Prize Amalgam, and Bloodghast, all of which are creatures that can bring themselves back from your graveyard to kill your opponent. Dredge is universally considered one of Wizards' biggest mistakes. The thing is, it's both really easy to pull off a big Dredge that mills a ton of cards, and really hard to interact with Dredge in a meaningful way. The most common forms of disruption in Magic are removal, discard, and counter spells. None of these things work against Dredge. They still have access to all their Dredgers in the graveyard, and will still get to draw a card on their draw step, and therefore mill and make all their plays. The only way to interact with Dredge is by playing graveyard hate cards, and you can't really main board these sorts of hate cards. So, the only way to stop Dredge from being the best deck in the format is to make sure they're slow enough that even if they're favored to win game 1, they have a hard time winning games 2 and 3 once your opponent has the graveyard hate. And this is where Golgari-Grave Troll comes in. You see, Dredge 6 is the highest Dredge number in the game, so Grave Troll kind of is the best Dredge card because it puts the most amount of cards into your graveyard. Banning Grave Troll made Dredge slow enough that other decks could compete with it. Could Grave Troll be unbanned? No. In fact, Wizards actually tried that back in 2015, and it was too good, so they had to ban it again in 2017. Dredge is still a good deck in Modern, and giving the Grave Troll back could easily make them too good, especially since they have 2 other copies of Cathartic Reunion, the best Dredge enabler in Modern right now, due to letting you discard and draw so many cards. Unbanning Grave Troll would most certainly make Dredge decks too strong. How could Grave Troll be fixed to be unbanned? The only thing that matters on the card is its Dredge ability, so you would have to nerf that. You might be thinking that bumping it down to Dredge 5 like Stinkweed Imp would be fine, but Dredge decks getting another 4 copies of Imp might still make the deck too consistent, so it should probably knock down to Dredge 4 just to be safe. Keeping with the theme of good graveyard decks, let's look at Dread Return decks. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of 2 and 2 black that allows you to return a creature from the graveyard to the battlefield. It also has flashback cost of sacrificing 3 creatures, which means you can cast it from the graveyard for its flashback cost, but you exile it afterwards. Why was Dread Return banned? If you remember what we talked about with Grave Troll and how good Dredge is, you probably remember how easy it is to mill a whole bunch of cards and to cheat free creatures out by milling cards to your graveyard. This makes Dread Return an extremely easy way to cheat out big, terrifying threats super early. In fact, it's probably the easiest way to cheat out any creature you want, if you're willing to just mill a whole bunch of cards. Could Dread Return be unbanned? Absolutely not. Dread Return is probably the least safe card to unban that's currently on the modern ban list. You see, there's this deck called Oops All Spells in Legacy that uses Balustrad's Spy to mill their entire deck, cheat out free Necromoebas, and then use Dread Return to win the game. In order to do this, you have to run no lands in your deck, which is pretty easy in Legacy with all the fast mana cards and the muddled dual-face lands, cards that are spells on the front, but lands on the back. Now, Modern doesn't have access to fast mana cards that are in Legacy, but it does have access to the modeled dual-face lands, so the deck definitely would be viable, even if it wasn't amazing. Though what makes Dread Return so scary, outside of enabling another very strong combo deck, is the fact that it would still be really good in Dredge. Again, Dredge is great at putting a whole bunch of tiny Necromoebas and Bloodghast on the field, which means it could easily make use of Dread Return alongside cards like Lotleth Giant, which has the ability where when it enters the battlefield it deals 1 damage to your opponent for each creature card in your graveyard, or even just Ox of Agonas that the deck already runs to make the deck even stronger. Seeing as there are 2 decks that Dread Return coming back would almost certainly instantly break, it definitely needs to stay banned. How could Dread Return be fixed to be unbanned? Really, the only way to fix the card is to make it so the flashback ability costs mana. The combination of being able to cheat out a card from the graveyard while it's in your graveyard for no mana is just too strong with self-mill strategies. It makes it so the way you get the creatures to pay Dread Return's costs, the way you get the threat into the graveyard to reanimate it, and the way you find Dread Return to use it in the first place are all the exact same action, putting cards from your deck into the graveyard. Even if you make it so you have to sacrifice 6 creatures, Dredge would still probably play to bring back a big creature that burns your opponent during their second main phase after swinging in for a ton of damage to close games. The deck already plays Conflagrate to burn your opponent out, so giving them a second card that lets them do direct damage to your opponent would just make it really, really easy for them to get turn 4 kills, on top of all the other problems with Dredge as a deck. Even doing something like making it so that you can only keep your creature for 1 turn, by making it so that it exiles the card at the beginning of your end step, wouldn't fix any of these issues. The only way to make Dread Return fair is to make its flashback cost at least 4 mana, which would put it in line with cards like Unburial Rites, a card which sees niche play in Modern every once in a while. If you wanted to make Dread Return very powerful but not quite broken, you could maybe make its flashback cost 3 mana on top of sacrificing 3 creatures, but that might still just be too good anyway. But again, I think saying make it cost more mana is kind of the cheater way to fix a card, so I really do think that Dread Return is just a broken card. Next up, we have Sensei's Divining Top. This is an artifact that costs 1 mana and has the abilities where you can pay 1 to look at the top 3 cards of your library, then put them back in any order. You can also tap it to draw a card and then put the top on top of your library. So, why was Sensei's Divining Top banned? First off, the card is just really good at giving you a ton of card selection and helping you find the cards you want. However, what really broke the card was combining it with cards that cared about the top card of your library. One card that was very abusable with this was Counterbalance. This is an enchantment with a mana cost of 2 blue with the ability where whenever your opponent casts a spell, you can reveal the top card of your library. And if its mana value is the same as the spell they cast, you counter it. What players would do is activate Top's ability to rearrange top 3 cards of the deck in response to Counterbalance triggering. So if any of the 3 cards in your deck had the same mana value as your card, it was getting countered. This interaction was a big part of why Top saw play in Legacy in a deck called Blue-White Miracles, before it was banned in the format as well in 2017. Beyond working with Counterbalance, Top also worked really well with the Miracle mechanic. How Miracle worked is that if the first card you drew that turn was a card with a Miracle, you could cast it for its Miracle cost, which would be a lot less than its normal mana cost. Miracles ran cards like Terminus and Entreat the Angels alongside Sensei's Divining Top, and it was able to put them on top of their deck whenever they wanted to get that Miracle effect. Even better, because of the way Miracle is worded, it actually gets around timing restrictions. What this means is that if you drew a Terminus as the first card you drew that turn during your opponent's turn, you could cast it for its Miracle cost. Combining this with Top's ability to draw you a card, and you essentially have a 1-mana instant speed board wipe. Now, the power of a deck like this is certainly a big part of why Top is banned in the format, but there's actually an additional problem with the Top. You see, Top really slows down games, because you have to activate it multiple times in a turn and constantly be thinking about what you should be doing with it, which takes a lot of thought and therefore time. On top of that, it was usually played in control decks, which are already slow, grindy decks that take a lot of time to play. This led to a problem where back when Blue-White Miracles was a big deck in Legacy, big tournaments were being slowed down by so many matches going to time in the round. In Magic tournaments, players are only given so much time to play their matches, and if they run out of time, they get a certain number of turns to complete their game before the game is considered a draw. Divining Top dragged out games to time a lot, and even once it hit time, it dragged out those games longer than usual too. This led to lots of delays in tournaments that were a huge headache for tournament organizers and staff. Additionally, more cards have come out since then that have made it even stronger. Bolas's Citadel is an artifact that costs 3 and 3 black and has the ability where you can cast the top card of your deck by paying life equal to its mana value rather than paying its mana cost. With Diviner Top's ability to draw the top card of your deck and put itself back on top of your deck, this lets you draw through your whole library paying 1 life for Top over and over. Similarly, there's a card called Mystic Forge that lets you cast the top card of your deck as long as it's an artifact or a colorless card. If you combine this with Divining Top and something to decrease the cost of your artifacts by 1, you can draw through your entire deck. Currently, Top is still seeing play all the way back in Vintage with Bolas's Citadel. So not only was Top just a very strong card, it also had some really undesirable effects on a game outside of just being strong. Can Sensei's Divining Top be unbanned? No. Now, while most of the cards that made Top good, specifically Counterbalance and Miracles, are legal in Modern, it is worth noting that a big part of these decks in Legacy, specifically Brainstorm, isn't legal in the format. So there is a question about if Top would be too inconsistent or slow nowadays. However, the issue with leading to games going to time and holding up tournaments hasn't gone away. And if you read Wizards' banned and restricted announcement, they make it clear that this is a big reason why the card ended up getting banned. That's not even mentioning the other uses for the card that have come out since then. Ultimately, Divining Top would likely still be too strong and cause too many issues to be unbanned. How could you fix Sensei's Divining Top so it could be unbanned? This one is a bit difficult, but I think making it so that both of its abilities were sorcery speed, meaning you could only activate them on your turn during your main phase while the stack is empty, would make it worse enough that it could be unbanned. One hidden strength of Diviner Top that I didn't explicitly mention yet is how hard the card is to remove. If your opponent tries to kill it with a removal spell, you could always simply use its ability in response to hide it on top of your deck. This made the counter top combo very hard to disrupt on top of everything else. So making both the ability and the ability to rearrange the top cards of your deck sorcery would fix most of the issues with the card, as players couldn't use its ability to stack their deck on their opponent's turn anymore. Though it would still maybe be too good with cards like Bolas's Citadel, so to be extra safe you might need to have it enter tapped or something. Honestly, the fact that I feel the need to nerf it that hard to make it safe shows just how strong the card is, which is ultimately the point of this exercise. And the last card we'll be covering in today's video is Hypergenesis. This is a sorcery with no mana cost, meaning it can't be cast normally. It does, however, have a suspend 3 for 1 and 2 green, meaning you can pay 1 and 2 green to exile it with 3 time counters on it. Then on each of your upkeeps you remove a time counter from it, and when you remove the last one you can cast it without paying its mana cost. When it does resolve, it has the effect where, starting with you, each player may put out a land, creature, artifact, or enchantment card from their hand to the battlefield, and then you repeat this process until someone doesn't put a permanent onto the battlefield. Hypergenesis is part of a cycle where they took old classic cards with really strong effects and nerfed them by making suspended only versions of them. Hypergenesis is a suspend-only version of Eureka, which as you can see here, has the exact same effect. Both of these cards don't care about what you put onto the battlefield, so you can put huge threats into play for very little mana with them, and your opponent likely won't have anything near as good to cheat in. Why is Hypergenesis banned? On its own, Hypergenesis wouldn't be that big of a problem. The issue is all the ways you can cast Hypergenesis early. You see, there are a few cards that happen to synergize very well with suspend-only cards, specifically Cascade. Cascade is the keyword where, whenever you cast a spell with Cascade, you exile a card to the top of your deck until you exile a card that costs less. Then, you cast that card without paying its mana cost, and put all the rest of them on the bottom of your deck. What this means is that if you hit a suspend-only card with Cascade, you can cast it right away. Even better, if you run no cards that cost less than your Cascade spells, which means no cards that cost 3 or less, you can always hit your Cascade-only cards. This interaction is the backbone of 2 decks in Modern already, Living End and Crashing Footfalls. Living End basically swaps all creatures in the battlefield with creatures in the graveyard, and Crashing Footfalls makes you 2 4/4 green Rhino creature tokens with Trample. These decks are both really strong, but Hypergenesis has a few things that would make it more dangerous than these decks. Living End needs creatures in your graveyard to work, so it has to run a bunch of creatures with cycling, so that they can have creatures in the graveyard to reanimate. This means that Living End decks can put up very threatening boards, but they can't afford to run very many good cards in their deck. Crashing Footfalls can get away with playing a bunch of cards that are actually pretty decent, like Prismari Command and Brazen Borrower, but its payoff is just 2 4/4 Tramplers, which is good, but not unbeatable. Hypergenesis has the best part of both of these cards. You can run a whole bunch of good cards in your deck like Footfalls decks can, but instead of simply making 2 4/4s, you'll be cheating out Urmkools and Grizzlebrands. This would basically make the deck a better version of Footfalls deck that could win way faster. Could Hypergenesis be unbanned? Probably not, but the reason here is actually kind of interesting. You see, more so than just being too good for the format, unbanning Hypergenesis would basically outmode 2 already popular and unique decks, Living End and Crashing Footfalls, and making one deck that's just better than both of them. Now, there are some downsides to Hypergenesis over these decks, namely that you need the cards you want to cheat out in your hand, but the threats are so much better and there are enough viable cards to boost consistency that Hypergenesis would almost certainly end up being the stronger deck. So unbanning Hypergenesis would do nothing but make 2 different unique decks unplayable and add nothing to the metagame, so it's much better for it to simply remain banned. How could Hypergenesis be fixed to be unbanned? This is the hardest one to fix so far. You see, the idea behind Hypergenesis is simple: be a suspend-only version of Eureka. However, this inherently leads to all the problems we've talked about so far. The number of turns you have to wait for the suspend ability and the cost of the suspend ability don't matter because you're never casting it that way. However, changing anything else about the card kind of ruins the design. If you give it a mana cost, it no longer is part of the suspend-only cycle, and if you change its effect, it's not a copy of Eureka anymore. Really, there's just no way to fix this card without changing the fundamental design of the card. Alright, and that's the first part of the series. In each one, we'll be going about 5 cards in each episode until we go over all of them. So, if you have any ideas for future videos similar to this one, please let us know down in the comments.